Okay, Bill, what do you think of what happened with Trump and Gaza? What was your reaction?
Well, it was a surprise, but you know what? I've learned that there's no surprises anymore in the Middle East, Janie. I mean, from pages being blown up in Hezbollah's hands to uh, the Assad regime being toppled surprisingly, like in 24 hours, to missile defense systems being shot down by Israel and Iran, to the latest thing with Donald Trump. I'm realizing that everything can change on a dime in the Middle East anymore, Janie. So my initial response was I'm surprised, but at this point, I guess there's no need to be surprised anymore because everything's changing in the Middle East. Now,
Okay.
go ahead.
Oh, no, no. It's just people are, wondering, is this a fulfillment of Bible prophecy? Is this going to lead into any wars? And of course, you're the expert on the coming wars in the Middle East. But I mean, what do you think?
I personally think it's biblically endorsed, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. But it's interesting when you look at some of the comments. It looked as though Netanyahu was a bit in shock when he heard it. Seemed to be surprised, but then later he did an interview on Fox, and it says, and the headline on says, the first good idea I've heard in a long time. He's endorsing the plan. And matter of fact, some of the right-wing leaders in Israel are saying it's remarkable. They're using that term. So he's seemingly not proposing a two-state solution for the Palestinians. He's not endorsing that. He's not even proposing a one-state solution. He seems to be proposing a zero-state solution for the Palestinians. It's kind of shocking to me, but I mean, I do believe it's biblically endorsed. Now, here's a headline that came out just recently that Israeli Defense Minister Dan Katz has ordered the Israeli Defense Forces to prepare a voluntary exit plan for the Gaza. So they're already moving on this, Janie. And if you'd like, we can talk about why I think it's biblically endorsed next.
Absolutely. But where are these people going to go?
Well, the proposal is a voluntary exit into Egypt primarily, but also to Jordan. But the issue is now going to be a problem for that because here's a couple of headlines about, let's say, Jordan yesterday on the Middle East Eye said if Jordan's ready for war with Israel, if the Palestinians are expelled into its territory. So, they got that fragile peace treaty from 1994 that now is going to be in jeopardy if there's any expelling of these Palestinians into Jordan. And then here's one came out just today from Times of Israel on Egypt. It's basically Egypt said privately, didn't say publicly, but privately to Trump's people, that this Gaza plan endangers the peace treaty with Israel. So basically what he's proposing is the Arab states take them, namely Egypt and Jordan. And both those countries have peace treaties with Israel. They're fragile, and they will be voided out according to biblical prophecies, which we can get into also, time permitting today, Janie. But basically at this point, he wants them to go into Egypt and into Jordan. It seems to be.
Okay, so now how come you think that this is a fulfillment of Bible prophecy?
Well, if we look at Jeremiah chapter 12, verses 14 through 17, and I'll go ahead and read this to your viewers in just a moment, but God knew that when he brought the Jews back in the land, which would fulfill many prophecies, and 1948, of course, that happened on May 14th, 1948, he knew that there'd be this problem in the Middle East between the Arabs and the Jews because the ancient hatred that had been over there since time immemorial never went away when the Jews were in the diaspora. In fact, it became enveloped under the umbrella of Islam. So he knew that he'd have to have a peace plan, a sort of a relocation. I call it a land for peace plan extraordinaire, and I'll read it to you. It comes in a couple of different parts here. Jeremiah chapter 12, verses 14 says, "Thus says the Lord against all my evil neighbors," calls them evil neighbors, very forceful language, "who touch the inheritance which I have caused my people Israel to inherit. Behold, I will pluck them out of their land and pluck out the house of Judah from among them. And it shall be, after I have plucked them out, that I will return and have compassion on them and bring them back, everyone, not just the Jews, but everyone, to his heritage and everyone to his land." So let's stop right there. That's part one. So God's basically saying, he's calling the neighbors the true color of their evil neighbors, the Arab states that border Israel. He said, look, well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you guys your states back. We're going to pluck you out, forceful language, because they won't want to go voluntarily. We're going to put you back into your states, pull you out of the land. It's not going to be called Israel. And there's going to be Jews living in those Arab states. We're going to pluck them out, and they're going to go back into, after years of being out in those Arab states, Arab lands, bring them back into their own homeland, now to be called Israel. He said, and when I do that, I'm going to have compassion on everybody, back to your heritage, back to your culture, and it's going to be a land for peace still extraordinaire. It's going to be a real blessing. I'm going to bless it, and you'll be able to dwell in the midst of my people. But here's what he says: is the only condition. And let me break this down. How this happened. Sovereignly, this started to happen after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. They'd ruled over the Middle East from 1517 to 1917, and then World War I, they were defeated, and then all of a sudden the Arab states started to come in. You had Egypt in 1922. You had Saudi Arabia and Iraq in 1932. You had Lebanon in 1943. You had Syria and Jordan in 1946, and then along comes Israel in 1948. So you see that God was doing this sovereign act to give these Arabs their states back so they can get back into their lands, back to their heritages. An awesome plan orchestrated by God for the benevolence of the whole Middle East. But here's the condition that goes with it. They need to be thankful for what happened. And here's what he says in verse 16 and 17. Verse 16 says, "And it shall be, if they will learn carefully the ways of my people," of course that's the Jews, "to swear by my name, as the Lord lives, as they taught my people to swear by Baal, and they will be established in the midst of my people." So what he's saying here is that all I'm asking for this great work I'm doing to benefit all of you and bring you back into your heritage and your culture is that you swear by my name, and with the same zeal that you caused my people back in Jeremiah's time to swear by Baal. Now, back at that time, Jeremiah, they were actually so devoted to Baal, they were worshiping their children to Baal. Now, God's not, of course, saying you got to sacrifice your children, but he's saying with that same zeal, worship me, the God of the Bible, the God of the Jews. And if you do that, you'll dwell in the midst of my people. That was his plan. But here's the caveat, and it's very powerful, and this is where this is all going to go. He says, "But if they do not obey and swear by my name, I will utterly pluck up and destroy that nation, says the Lord." So ultimately, these Arab states are out of compliance. Egypt and Jordan are balking. No, we do not want these Palestinians. The peace treaties will be threatened. War will ensue with us. And they've been a war, of course, in 1948, 1967, 1973. And ultimately, I think they climaxed in a Psalm 83 war, a final war, Arab-Israeli war in Psalm 83 and elsewhere. But I believe that this is biblically endorsed. God, Trump's offering to send these Palestinians back into Egypt and Jordan is actually, I think, a grace and mercy from God, giving them one more opportunity after all they've done, especially the Hamas treatment on October 7th, the killings and everything. He's basically, I think, offering them more grace, saying, "Look, you have one more chance here to go back into these lands where you belong, and there's not going to be a Palestinian state. It's going to be a Jewish state. It's what my plans are."
Now, can't some people say, though, if Trump is saying we're taking over Gaza, that then it's not belonging to Israel anymore? That's just, I'm seeing all different conflicting comments.
Well, yeah, there's concerns. I'm getting emails too, lots of them, basically saying, "Is this not, dividing the land? Is this not going to be a curse to America?" and this sort of thing. I don't really necessarily see it that way. I don't think we're trying to take over the land. I think we're trying to get in there and, Trump, of course, was one of the most successful real estate developers in the world's history. And of course, he's sitting there saying, "Let's relocate these Palestinians and let's, get some oceanfront property and let's redevelop it." He called it the Riviera of the Middle East, right? And so I think he's just basically saying, let's get over there and redevelop it. And then it's seemingly suggesting they'd have the opportunity, the Palestinians, to come back into this land. Now, the concerns of the Palestinians and the Arabs, who are all in an uproar, is that Israel won't allow them to come back into the land. And that's a legitimate concern. So, it could be considered that we're intruding on God's land. Now, that land over there, we should look at some scriptures about that land and what the prophecies talk about. But that land over there does belong to the tribe of Judah, and ultimately it will be in the millennium, the Messianic kingdom, for pastures for shepherds and for flocks. And it'll be more of a farming agricultural area, which at this point, of course, it's a demolished zone from a war.
But everyone, when you have been on my program before, and I'll put some links in the description, you've explained a lot of the upcoming wars that are, throughout the scriptures, and your book explains a lot of it. But I think people, you have talked about that there would be, peace or unwalled, villages. before like Ezekiel 38. Am I correct? Or so it's like, but if this is happening, could this cause a war and then there wouldn't be peace? Or is there going to be peace for a short time before a war breaks out? Maybe you can explain.
Ezekiel 38 is a powerful prophecy, Ezekiel 38 and 39, and it's a situation where Russia brings a coalition of 9 members, including Turkey and Iran, to invade Israel in the latter days for plunder and booty. And we're told in that prophecy that God's going to stop that supernaturally through a great earthquake, fire, hailstone, brimstone, flooding rains. It'll be a supernatural victory. America won't be involved. The Israeli Defense Forces won't be involved. God's going to stop it. And it says, and after he does that, in Ezekiel 39, verse 7, I will make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel. They shall not profane it anymore, and the nations will know that I'm the Lord, the Holy One in Israel. So God's going to make a statement there that he's the holy God of the Jewish people, the covenant keeper of Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant, promise keeper of Jesus Christ. And that's the main marquee event prophetically in the end times that God's going to do that in. But it says that there's some prerequisite conditions in that. We're told in Ezekiel 38, verses 7 through 13, that Israel has to be brought back into the land. We'll give that a check mark. Out from persecution, give that a check mark. They must be dwelling safely in the land of unwalled villages, without bars nor gates, dwelling securely, with great booty and plunder, because that's, of course, what Russia is coming after with its hordes, is the plunder and booty. That's their motive. And we don't find Israel in that condition right now, because they have surrounding them those evil neighbors who have been at war with them, all the surrounding countries.
Yeah, before you go on, I just want to make sure that people know that we're not calling those people evil. It's just that them, when they're not listening to what the Lord wants, that's what God is saying is evil.
Right. Well, Jeremiah 12 called them evil neighbors, so I believe that's who he's talking about. But to be politically correct, I mean, that's up to you.
Okay.
But basically what it says here is that since Israel's not dwelling securely right now, and therefore the Ezekiel 38 major prophecy can't find fulfillment until they are, here's how Ezekiel tells us when that will happen. And you're talking about a potential war beforehand, and I'll tell you that appears to be the situation. And here's what we find on Ezekiel 28, verses 24 through 26. And there shall no longer be a pricking briar or a painful thorn for the house of Israel from among all those who are around them, who despise them. Talking about the same neighborhood. There are states around them who have been at war with them. They're considered by God here a pricking briar and a painful thorn. And basically, I'll read it again. A painful thorn for the house of Israel from among all those around them who despise them. And they shall know that I'm the Lord their God to them. And no longer when they're going to be despising Israel and being a painful thorn, then that things will change there and they'll dwell securely. And here's what it says. It goes on to verse 25. Thus says the Lord God, when I have gathered the house of Israel from the peoples among whom they are scattered. We talked about that check mark there. That's back in the land. And I'm be hallowed in them in the sight of the Gentiles. Then they will dwell in their own land, which I gave to my servant Jacob. And they will dwell safely. They will build houses. They will plant vineyards. Yes, they will dwell securely. So the same two words, dwell safely and securely, are used in Ezekiel 38. Same Yeshab Batak, it's talking about. They'll dwell securely only when it says this, when I execute judgments on all those around them who despise them, and they shall know that I'm the Lord their God. So the point is here that God says he's going to utterly pluck up and destroy those nations in Jeremiah chapter 12:17. He says here that he's going to execute judgments upon them in Isaiah 28, verses 26. And the way he's going to do that, Janie, is through wars involving the Israeli Defense Forces who exist in fulfillment of Bible prophecy. We're told in Ezekiel 37:10 that Israel will come out of the Holocaust condition and they'll become an exceedingly great army. And we talked about this on the inception of the show. When you start watching pages exploding and assassinations of top leaders in Hezbollah and missile defense systems taking out in Iran and also in Syria now, you're looking at the manifestation and emergence of the exceedingly great army of Israel, whose sole purpose is to defend Israel from those enemies around them. And they've done that in the wars. And there'll be a concluding war, we're told, in Zechariah 12, verses 2 and 6, which talks about a time when the surrounding peoples, these countries we're talking about, those around them who God considers a painful thorn and a pricking briar, they're going to make a final siege on Judah and Jerusalem, it says. And at that time, God says, I'll make Jerusalem a cup of trembling to the nations round about when they make siege against Judah and Jerusalem. And it goes on and say how that's going to happen in Zechariah 12:6. So it'll be a final attempt. Remember, Jerusalem is the third holiest city in Islam. So anything that Trump's starting to work on now, should there be a relocation plan and these guys leaving, the Palestinians leaving into the Arab states, namely Egypt and Jordan, that's going to put a real wrinkle in all of Islam, because they want to still have their connections with Jerusalem, and the Palestinians are their connections there. So it says they'll make a final siege trying to take over Judah and Jerusalem. Zechariah 12:6 tells us that in that day, the Israeli Defense Forces, the governors of Judah, the captains of Judah, the battlefield will become like a fire pan on the woodpile, and Israel will defeat all those surrounding peoples on the right hand, and on the left it will devour them, but Jerusalem will remain intact. So basically what we have there is the final concluding war, which I think would end the Psalm 83 prophecy, which also talks about all these Arab states. So I think we have war coming, Janie. And what Trump is doing right now is actually going to upset these Arab states. Saudi Arabia is already coming out saying they won't be normalizing relationships. They're rebutting what Trump was hoping for. Until there's a Palestinian state, that's a prerequisite. So if they hold their guns there, again, they're going to be, along with Egypt and Jordan, they're going to be opposing this whole thing as well.
Can you explain, just like with the timeline, what war that you could think could be next, and the other wars that would lead up to before Armageddon?
Absolutely. Well, I would say Ezekiel 38, I personally believe we talked about it. I think that's before Armageddon, but we talked about the prerequisite conditions that Israel's got to be drawing securely, which they're not. But they will, of course, after the final Arab-Israeli war of Zechariah 12 happens, and that would, of course, fulfill the destruction of the nations in Jeremiah 12, verses 17, and the getting rid of the painful thorn in Ezekiel 28, verses 26 that we were talking about. I think that is part of Psalm 83. Now, the peripheral prophecies of Psalm 83 that we get involved as well with Jordan and Egypt as well, we'll talk about those in a moment. But the way I'm sequencing events, we've got Psalm 83 would probably precede Ezekiel 38, because that is when Israel could dwell securely in the land. There'd be no more Arab threat around them. It's also important to note that in Psalm 83, you got all the surrounding neighbors of Israel, those that will make a final siege on Judah and Jerusalem in Zechariah 12, verse 2. But none of them are listed in Ezekiel 38. Why not? Because they're probably dealt with prior in Psalm 83 scenario. All the other countries listed in Ezekiel 38, which would be Russia, Turkey, Iran, North African countries of Ethiopia, Libya, probably Somalia, Tunisia, maybe Morocco, some of the former Soviet Union countries as well, maybe to the north. They form an outer ring of countries around Israel. They don't share common borders with Israel like the Psalm 83 countries, which include Lebanon, where Hezbollah is, Gaza, where the Hamas are, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. Now, those are all part of Psalm 83, the neighborhood states that are going to make a final siege on Judah and Jerusalem. They're not in Ezekiel 38. Why not? Because they're probably taken out prior so that Israel can dwell securely, and that's when Ezekiel 38 could happen. So I see that happening first, those related prophecies. And I see Ezekiel 38, but there's even two more prophecies I'm looking at, Jamie. One of them is the destruction of Damascus. Isaiah verses 17, which says, one day it says, behold, Damascus will cease from being a city. It will become a ruinous heap. It will be reduced to rubble. to rubble. And then it says in Isaiah 17:9, it says that there will be desolation in Syria and other major cities, not just Syria, caused by the children of Israel. Again, here we go, the Israeli Defense Forces. It goes on to say in Isaiah 17, verse 14, as it concludes, that one day you see Damascus, it says see him in the masculine pronoun, meaning Damascus, but in the morning, overnight, over in the morning, he is no more. This is the portion of those who rob us and those who plunder us, meaning in self-defense. Overnight, Israel takes out Damascus. Now, it's interesting that since Assad regime has toppled, Israel moved into a buffer zone in the Golan Heights and it's expanded its territory all the way up to parts of Mount Hermon. And an article came out about a week ago that says on a clear day from Mount Hermon, now you can see Damascus. I thought it was interesting when I read that article because on a clear day you're going to see it, but on some clear morning you won't see it. It'll be gone. And I was thinking for the longest time that was going to be because the Assad regime, as a proxy of Iran, was going to come against Israel with Hezbollah and a massive multi-front war, which they were doing. But now it's not. They're out of the picture seemingly for this point in time. So the prophecy is still going to find fulfillment, but who's going to be in charge of Syria at the time? Like I said in the beginning of the program, everything's changing so rapidly. We just don't know who's who at this point. All we do is gravitate toward looking at the scriptures and what the prophecies say. And even before that, there's another prophecy in Iran, Jamie, in Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 34 through 39, dealing with the west coast, southern west coast of Iran, ancient territory called Elam, E-L-A-M. And that prophecy talks about a disaster that's going to happen over there. It sounds like it'll be a nuclear disaster. And that's a whole other prophecy. If time permitting, we can talk about that. But that, I think, would precipitate all the other ones as well.
Huh. Okay. Yeah. Why don't you explain that?
Okay. I actually think this one could be next because I recently did an article on my website at prophecydepot.com, Prophecy Depot like HomeDepot.com. It says the reasons Israel will likely strike Iran's nuclear sites soon. I give 9 different reasons for that. And one of the reasons on the end says it may be foretold in this prophecy that I'm going to tell you about. Basically, the prophecy in Jeremiah chapter 49, which was written about 596 BC, before Ezekiel 38 was written. Ezekiel and Jeremiah were contemporaries, but Ezekiel wrote the Ezekiel 38 prophecy about a decade after Jeremiah's prophecy that I'm about to go over. Jeremiah wrote about Elam, which is on the western side, hugs the Persian Gulf, but Ezekiel wrote about Persia, 2 distinctly different ancient territories. Today they compose modern-day Iran. Now, basically what Jeremiah said, specifically to the western coast area of Elam, that someday the Lord is going to be fiercely angry with the leaders of Iran. We know this because he says that in the prophecy he's going to destroy the kings and the princes from there. They're fiercely angering him, and he's going to bring about a disaster, it says. And so we find out that when the disaster happens, well, first of all, why is he upset with these leaders? It says that he's going to break the bow of Elam at the foremost of their might, meaning they want to launch something lethal somewhere. He's going to prohibit that. He's going to break the bow, which at this point would be missile launching capabilities, which, by the way, most of all of Iran's missile launching capabilities are in this territory, closest to Israel they can get on the southwestern side of Iran and the ancient Elam territory. He's going to break the bow at the foremost of their might. Perhaps that's dealing with their atomic program, nuclear perhaps. It says when he does that, there'll be a disaster. It goes on to say the disaster seems to spark a humanitarian crisis because it says it'll bring the 4 winds from the 4 quarters of heaven, and it'll scatter all those Elamites into the nations. There'll be no nations where the outcasts of Elam don't go. So it sounds like a humanitarian crisis, perhaps nuclear generated. Now in that area right now you have the Natanz nuclear enrichment facility. You have the Isfahan facility where they do the research for the missiles. You have the Shiraz also is there. You have the Bushehr nuclear reactor. So it's a nuclear contained area where Israel will be striking, among other places inside deeper into Iran. So you see you got all these nuclear sites that Israel will probably take out. Matter of fact, they've already struck the Isfahan facility and their second retaliation back in October. A drone struck and hit it, so they've already got a history of doing that. Basically, and then it says at that point there'll be a worldwide dispersion. So I'm looking at a potential disaster in Iran, potentially nuclear, that would lead to other things, perhaps the destruction of Damascus on into Psalm 83.
Wow. Okay. Boy, lots of details, Bill. Now, do you think that some people are speculating that the temple could be rebuilt?
Well, the temple will be rebuilt. We find that in several
through Trump. They're wondering if he's going to, if it's going to be under him.
Well, that's interesting, and that's not new news because in his first administration, when he came through and he moved the embassy to Jerusalem, they were starting to mint a coin. The Sanhedrin were minting a coin, thinking he would, if he could, they'd implement the building of the temple, he would support that. And the coin had a picture of him and King Cyrus, the great Gentile king of the Persians that sent the Jews back to Israel to rebuild the second temple. Had a picture, if you recall, a coin minted with Trump and King Cyrus on it. So they were thinking back then he would help build the temple. Right now there's also talk about not just building the temple, which they'll probably be pushing for that more and more now that he's settling into office on his second term. They're also talking about annexing the Judea and Samaria, now called falsely the West Bank. But they were talking about annexing that territory, and they think Trump will support that. as part of the sovereign territory, like the Golan Heights became sovereign according to Trump's acknowledgement in his first term. They think he'll acknowledge that the Judea and Samaria will be the biblical heartland, will also be annexed into the territory. Now, that would cause a major stir in the Islamic world if he did that, and he likely might do that. I'm going to almost predict that he probably will do that, depending how much further he can go along these lines.
Right, and I think that he mentioned that there were going to be talks about that maybe in March. And also, I thought, is it Pete Hegseth that also talked about rebuilding the temple? I may have it wrong, but I thought that he had said that too. There's a lot going on. Is there anything else you want to add?
Well, I would say that Senator Tom Cotton right now is proposing legislation that basically would recognize the West Bank as Judea and Samaria. So, I mean, we're already getting a lot of Republican leaders pushing on that same calling card. So it'd be real easy for Trump to follow suit and say, okay, let's do that. Let's let them annex that territory. Again, these are the types of things that upset the Islamic world and cause these wars we're talking about. It's important to note that we're talking about Egypt and Jordan in this program quite a bit, about perhaps assimilating into their countries, which they're opposed to Palestinians. And Jordan has a fragile peace treaty with Israel. We're told that's going to go away in Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 2, that says, "Therefore, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that will cause to be heard an alarm of war in Rabbah of the Ammonites." Now, that's Amman, Jordan. That's the capital of Jordan. "And it will be a desolate mound, and her villages shall be burned with fire. Then Israel shall take possession of his inheritance." So it's going to be a desolate mound as a result of a war between Israel and Jordan. We get a different camera angle of that in Zephaniah chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. It says, "I have heard the reproach of Moab," that's central Jordan, "and the insults of the people of Ammon," we just talked about them in Amman, Jordan, which say, "I have reproached my people and made arrogant threats against their borders," the borders of Israel. And it goes on to say, "Because of that, the residue of my people shall plunder them." That would be the Israeli Defense Forces. "And the remnant of my people shall possess them." So it's just a different camera angle. So ultimately, there's going to be a war. Ammon and Jordan is also part of Psalm 83. They're part of those neighbors. They're going to lay siege on Judah and Jerusalem, and they're going to lose, and Israel's going to annex more territory. Now, those lands of Jordan are actually part of the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob from the river of Egypt in Genesis 15:18, probably the Nile to the river of the Euphrates, which courses through modern-day Iraq and Syria. So that's one prophecy there. And then Egypt also has prophecies to be concerned about as well. We're told in Isaiah 19 that someday there's going to be, the land of Egypt will be like a woman. This will be Isaiah 7. Let me enlarge this on my screen here. Isaiah 19, all the way up to verse 18, it talks about a judgment coming into Egypt. One of the judgments of the end times for Egypt. There's two, but this is one that I think involves Israel. And it says, "In that day, there'll be a woman," and basically, let me caveat this. Egypt goes into a major downslide economically. A judgment hits because the Lord's judging Egypt. And we don't find out till why until we get to these verses. It says, "In that day, Egypt will be like a woman, will be afraid because of the waving of the hand of the Lord of hosts, which he waves over it. And the land of Judah will be a terror." It's Israel to the land of Egypt. "Everyone who makes mention of it will be afraid in himself because the counsel of the Lord of hosts, which has determined against it." So there's going to be a confrontation, yet future. Egypt is also part of Psalm 83 and one of those surrounding neighboring Arab states. They're opposing Trump's move right now. It goes on to say, in the aftermath of that confrontation between Judah and Egypt, it says, "In that day, 5 cities in the land of Egypt will speak the language of Canaan," which is Hebrew, "and swear by the Lord of hosts, and will be called the city of destruction." So in other words, after the war goes on, Israel actually annexed 5 cities into the land of Egypt, because that is also part of the promised land. So Egypt and Jordan are treaties with Israel are going to go by the wayside, in my estimation. And we see this push going on with Trump is liable to make that happen even sooner than we think. Now, remember this, that I'm going to read one more prophecy before we conclude here in Zephaniah chapter 2 about the Gaza area. Zephaniah 2 verses 1 through 3 talks about Israel being regathered into the land in a condition of unbelief, and that's been happening since 1948. But then it goes on to say in verse 4, Gaza shall be forsaken, and Ascalon shall be desolate. And it talks about Ashdod being driven out at noonday and uprooted, etc. These are countries, and these are ancient civilizations in the Gaza today. Gaza will be forsaken. The land of the Philistines I will destroy you, so there shall be no inhabitant. The seacoast, and then what's going to happen after that? It goes, the seacoast shall be for pastures. Remember, it's on the Mediterranean seacoast. Shelters for shepherds and folds for flocks. The coast shall be for the remnant of the house of Judah, not the Philistines, ancient Philistines of the Palestinians. And they shall feed their flocks there, in the houses of Ashkelon, and they shall lie down at evening. For the Lord their God will intervene for them and return their captives. So this is telling us here that after the regathering, which puts us in this time frame today, that that area is going to be judged, it'll be desolated, there'll be no inhabitants, the Lord's going to intervene. It's going to be ultimately, in the millennium, used for Judah territory for shepherds with folds of flocks per se. Now, we see that in order to do that, to get to that level, you have to get rid of all those Gaza buildings, which are all demolished right now. They've got to be removed. Then you got to turn that into pasture land. Now, if Trump gets in there, so in my estimation, that's probably already starting to happen. That's going to be, that's where this is going to go. I think we're that close on the end times line. But if Trump gets in there and rehabs the whole area and puts in Trump Towers and an airport and a Disneyland, and I'm being a little facetious. I don't know what he's really got planned. But, I mean, that would mean that God would have to destroy that. He'd have to be so mad at that to make it desolate and intervene in that scenario. And I just don't see that. That doesn't mean Trump won't try to do that he wouldn't start to try to build it and remove all that debris and everything like that. But I don't think his plans would come to final fruition, because ultimately that had to be destroyed again so that could be for shepherds and pastures for flocks. So I find this very interesting to be watching these events and the detail of these scriptures. And I would close in this saying, because things are changing so rapidly, we have to really gravitate our focus on the scriptures. What do the scriptures say about the prophecies? And that's what we've been doing today in your program, Janie.
Oh, very, very amazing, because you know these in detail. Okay, I know you mentioned your website before, but Bill, give your website again so people will know how to find you, and also see the books that you've written on all of this.
Thanks, Janie. ProphecyDepot.com, Prophecy Depot, like HomeDepot.com. We have an online bookstore. I've got 11 books and 11 teaching DVDs that go with those books. You can go on our online bookstore and get those if you want those additional resources. And all the stuff we're talking about today is covered in one or more of those books and DVDs.
Yes, and also I'll have the link in the description, and also a link to other interviews that I've done with Bill where he talks about these wars in detail. Thank you so much for being on.
Thanks, Janie.
In the last days, humankind will dwell in a war-torn world. Ancient biblical prophecies predict devastating regional conflicts in the Middle East, as well as world wars spanning the globe. Conventional battles, nuclear exchanges, and supernatural demonic invasions are coming. Billions will die. Famines, pestilences, and scarcities will plague the planet. As a result of these future wars, humankind will clamor for a leader who can restore order out of the chaos. The Bible calls him Antichrist. The Future War Prophecies book locates the battlefields, identifies the participants, explains the motives, provides the details, and explores the outcomes of these coming world-changing conflicts, which include the war fought between Israel and Iran, including its proxies of Syria, Hezbollah, and Hamas, the destruction of Damascus, the final war that ends the Arab-Israeli conflict, the invasion of Israel for plunder and booty by Russia, Turkey, Iran, and their 9-member coalition, the 2 Christian killing crusades of the tribulation period, the demonic invasion that torments unsaved people for 5 months, the 200 million demonic army that kills 1/3 of humankind, the war in heaven between Michael the Archangel versus Satan, the battle of Armageddon between Jesus Christ versus Antichrist, the final Gog of Magog war at the end of the millennium. These wars and more are covered in this revealing book and DVD. Don't be caught in the crossfire. Discover what wars are coming so that you can keep yourself and your loved ones out of harm's way.